Few films arrive quite like Flash Gordon did, a collision of comic book color, operatic performances, and a rock soundtrack that felt like nothing Hollywood had dared to attempt before. But beneath the spectacle was a production overflowing with secrets. Strange casting decisions, abandoned darker versions of the story, effects experiments that pushed the era's technology to its limits, and franchise plans that never came to be. And it all started with a single rejection, one that accidentally changed the course of cinema history forever. Number 1. The rights fight that created Star Wars. In the early 1970s, a young filmmaker with a vision for grand space adventure sat down with a problem he couldn't solve. George Lucas had grown up captivated by the Flash Gordon serials, the rocket ships, the alien worlds, the larger-than-life villains, and he wanted to bring that energy to a new generation. When he approached the rights holders about making a Flash Gordon film, however, the answer was no. The property was already spoken for, and no deal could be reached. Rather than abandoning the idea, Lucas stripped the concept down to its essentials: the heroic everyman, the wise mentor, the ruthless emperor, the princess in danger, and rebuilt it from scratch. The result was a story set in a galaxy far, far away, with its own mythology, its own language, and its own universe. Star Wars premiered in 1977, 3 years before Flash Gordon reached theaters, and became one of the highest-grossing films in history. The irony is remarkable. The very rejection that kept Flash Gordon out of Lucas's hands accidentally gave birth to a franchise that would dwarf almost everything that came before it. When the 1980 film finally arrived, audiences were already living in a world that Flash's DNA had helped create. They just didn't know it. Number 2. Flash's voice was rebuilt later. Behind the golden smile and athletic frame of Flash Gordon was a voice that, in many scenes, didn't actually belong to the man on screen. Sam J. Jones clashed repeatedly with producer Dino De Laurentiis during production, and by the time filming wrapped, the relationship had deteriorated badly. Jones departed before post-production was complete, leaving behind a film that still needed his voice to finish. The solution was a combination of looping and dubbing. In some scenes, Jones's own recordings were usable. In others, voice work was brought in to replace or supplement what had been captured on set. The result created an unusual disconnect between the physical performance, energetic, charismatic, and visually convincing, and the vocal delivery, which was assembled across different sessions and sources. For years, Jones spoke openly about his frustration with how the project unfolded. The experience left a complicated legacy for an actor who had delivered exactly what the role demanded physically. Curiously, the dubbed performance actually suits the film's theatrical, slightly surreal tone, but knowing the backstory adds a strange layer to every scene in which Flash opens his mouth. Number 3. Flash was found on a game show. The story of how the lead role was cast reads more like a Hollywood legend than a conventional audition process. Producer Dino De Laurentiis was watching television one evening when he spotted a young, broad-shouldered man on a game show. According to various accounts, the producer immediately felt he was looking at the comic strip hero come to life. The jaw, the build, the easy confidence that Flash Gordon demanded, and moved quickly to pursue him. The details of the story shift depending on who's telling it. Different interviews over the years have cited different shows as the moment of discovery, and Jones himself has described the sequence of events in varying ways. What remains consistent is the core, that a television appearance led directly to one of the more unusual casting decisions in science fiction cinema. Jones had limited acting experience at the time, which made the decision bold even by Hollywood standards. De Laurentiis was known for trusting instinct over resume, and in this case he bet on physical presence over proven craft. Whether that gamble paid off depends on who you ask, but there's no denying that Jones looked the part in a way few other actors could have matched. Number 4. Dale Arden was recast overnight. Casting Dale Arden proved to be one of the most turbulent decisions of the entire production. Dale Arden had already been selected for the role and was preparing for the film when the decision was abruptly reversed. Reports suggested the producer had concerns about on-screen chemistry or physical pairing with the lead. Melody Anderson was brought in as a replacement, quickly and with little warning. Haddon did not accept the situation quietly. She pursued legal action against the production, claiming wrongful dismissal and damages. The case brought unwanted attention to what had been intended as a discreet personnel change, raising questions about how the decision had been handled. The dispute was eventually settled, but the episode left a mark on the production's early history. Melody Anderson went on to deliver a performance that became entirely her own, warm, spirited, and a strong complement to Jones's physicality. Few audiences watching the finished film would ever guess that Dale Arden had once been someone else entirely. For Haddon, however, the overnight recast remained a defining and painful chapter in her career. Number 5. Pink Floyd almost did the music. The soundtrack that turned Flash Gordon into a cultural landmark almost sounded completely different. Before Queen entered the picture, director Mike Hodges had been developing the film's tone with a very specific musical reference playing in the background. He reportedly listened to The Dark Side of the Moon repeatedly during early development, drawn to its atmospheric depth and cinematic sweep. In his mind, the right companion for a mythic space adventure. The idea never advanced far enough to become a formal offer, and Queen's arrival shifted everything. Rather than simply writing background music, the band embedded dialogue, sound effects, and character moments directly into their compositions. It was an unusual approach for a major studio film, and one that gave the soundtrack an identity well beyond what most scores attempted. The opening theme alone, hammering guitar, operatic energy, and that instantly recognizable vocal hook became one of the most recognized pieces of music from that entire decade. Whether Pink Floyd's version would have been better is impossible to say, but it's almost certain it would have produced a very different film. Queen didn't just score Flash Gordon, they became inseparable from it. Number 6. The duel scene was truly dangerous. There are moments in filmmaking where spectacle and genuine physical risk become almost impossible to separate. The sky platform duel between Flash and Prince Baron is one of them. Constructed high above the studio floor, the set consisted of a narrow platform surrounded by spiked metal obstacles, rotating hazards, and almost no safe margin for error. The theatrical design that made the sequence look so visually striking was precisely what made it so physically demanding to film. Both Sam J. Jones and Timothy Dalton performed significant portions of the scene themselves, navigating the elevated structure without the safety infrastructure that modern productions would consider standard. A misstep in any direction could have sent either actor into the metal pieces surrounding the platform. The crew worked to minimize risk where possible, but the architecture of the set imposed real limits on how much protection could be offered. The finished sequence has an energy that's difficult to manufacture artificially. The tension reads as genuine because, in many ways, it was. Directors frequently speak about the way physical danger translates on screen in ways that rehearsed safety cannot quite replicate. Whatever risks were taken on that platform, the result is one of the most kinetic and memorable duels in science fiction cinema, charged with an urgency that still lands decades later. Number 7. Flash trained like a real athlete. Playing a character defined by physical heroism carries expectations that can't be faked once the camera gets close enough. Sam J. Jones understood this from the beginning, and by most accounts he approached the physical demands of the role with the same seriousness a professional athlete would bring to a competitive season. Daily runs and structured martial arts practice became the routine framework around which his days on set were built. The effort showed. Flash Gordon needed to feel like a man who had genuinely earned his reputation as a sports hero, not just someone in a fitted costume performing action beats. Jones's conditioning gave the performance an authentic physicality that telegraphed itself in movement, posture, and the ease with which he carried the role's more demanding sequences. There was little in the way of illusion involved. This commitment to physical preparation was notable, given how self-consciously theatrical the film was in almost every other respect. The sets were extravagant, the villains were operatic, and the tone balanced camp with adventure. Against all of that heightened artificiality, Jones's grounded athletic presence gave the film an unexpected anchor, a real body moving through an entirely unreal world. Number 8. The football fight was improvised. Not every great moment in cinema arrives through careful planning. Some of the most memorable scenes come from an actor recognizing an opportunity and trusting the instinct to take it. During preparation for one of the film's early action sequences, Sam J. Jones suggested using Flash's background as a professional football player as the engine for the fight itself, a connection the original script had left largely unexplored on a physical level. The result was a sequence in which ceremonial props, egg-shaped objects used in the Mongo court, became makeshift footballs. Flash didn't fight like a soldier or a trained combatant. He fought like the quarterback he was supposed to be, using the objects around him as extensions of a game he knew instinctively. The improvisation gave the scene a personality that set it apart from anything else in the film. It also helped answer a creative challenge the production had quietly been wrestling with: how to make Flash feel distinctly American in an environment so alien and theatrical. The football sequence solved that problem in about 90 seconds of screen time. What began as a suggestion on set became one of the moments audiences most often remember, a rare example of an actor genuinely shaping his own character during production. Number 9. Queen's soundtrack was secret. When one of the world's biggest rock bands agrees to score a science fiction film, you might expect the news to travel fast. Instead, the collaboration between Queen and the Flash Gordon production was kept deliberately quiet during the recording process. Rock acts contributing full scores to major studio films was still unusual enough in 1980 that both sides seemed to prefer working without the pressure of public attention. What emerged from that privacy was genuinely experimental. Rather than composing background music designed to sit beneath the action, the band wove actual dialogue from the film into the tracks themselves, lines from characters appearing mid-song as if the music and the story were the same organism. Sound effects, battle noise, and dramatic exchanges were folded into compositions that could function as standalone rock pieces, while simultaneously serving the film's narrative moments. The result was something the industry hadn't quite seen before. The album worked as a Queen record, but it also worked as a sonic version of the movie, something you could close your eyes and follow. Freddie Mercury's voice against Brian May's guitar gave the film an emotional register that no orchestral score could have provided. Decades on, it remains the definitive example of a rock soundtrack becoming genuinely inseparable from the film it was made for. Number 10. Hawkmen almost came from rugby. Casting the winged warriors of Mongo required a very specific physical type. Large, powerful, visually imposing men who could fill the screen with authority. Dino De Laurentiis, always drawn toward bold solutions, reportedly floated the idea of recruiting an entire professional rugby team. On paper, the logic was sound. These were athletes built for contact, comfortable with physical discomfort, and already accustomed to operating as a unit. Director Mike Hodges dismantled the idea quickly once the practical realities became clear. The Hawkmen sequences required performers to be suspended on wires for extended periods, not for a single dramatic shot, but repeatedly, across multiple shooting days, in physically demanding positions that had nothing to do with running or tackling. Professional athletes are trained for performance under specific conditions, and wire work for a film production was an entirely different discipline. The role ultimately went to performers and stunt professionals who could handle the technical requirements of flying sequences. It was a quieter solution than a rugby team, but a far more workable one. The episode stands as a useful reminder of how often the most visually exciting ideas in pre-production collide with the unglamorous physics of actually making them work on set. Number 11. Alien skies were made in water. Some of the most visually striking images in the film have an origin that audiences watching in 1980 never would have guessed. The swirling, layered skies of Mongo, those deep purples, burning oranges, and slow-moving cloudscapes that gave the planet its otherworldly atmosphere, were not painted backdrops or early computer graphics. They were water. The effects crew injected colored dyes into large tanks and filmed what happened as the pigments expanded, collided, and drifted through the liquid. The key to making it work was speed, or rather, the deliberate removal of it. Footage captured at normal speed looked exactly like what it was: dye dissolving in water. Slowed down significantly in post-production, however, the movement transformed into something vast and atmospheric. The same physical event that lasted seconds in a tank became minutes of alien sky when played back at the right rate, with a weight and scale that felt genuinely planetary. It was the kind of practical ingenuity that defined effects work in that era, finding elegant solutions within real constraints rather than reaching for tools that didn't yet exist. The Mongo skies have a quality that remains difficult to replicate digitally, precisely because they were created by actual physical matter, behaving according to its own laws. Audiences sensed something real, even when they couldn't identify what they were looking at. And that instinct was entirely correct. Number 12. Two movies exist at once. One of the more deliberately constructed aspects of the film is something many viewers absorbed without ever consciously noticing. Mike Hodges built the story to operate on two entirely separate levels simultaneously, a choice that required considerable discipline to execute without letting one register overwhelm the other. On the surface, the film worked as a straightforward, colorful adventure, the kind a child could follow with pure excitement from first frame to last. Underneath that surface was something considerably more layered: the exaggerated performances, the theatrical staging, and the film's knowing relationship with its own absurdity were aimed squarely at adult viewers who understood what was being gently satirized. Ming's imperious cruelty, the barely concealed flirtation running through almost every scene, and the gleeful excess of Mongo's court all carried a winking quality that children would simply read as entertainment, while adults recognized something more playful and self-aware. Hodges has spoken about this duality in interviews with evident satisfaction. It was never accidental. Achieving it required performances calibrated to work on both frequencies at once, sets that were simultaneously spectacular and slightly absurd, and a tone that never broke in either direction. The fact that the film still plays to audiences of wildly different ages without losing either group is perhaps the clearest evidence that the balancing act worked exactly as intended, a rare achievement in any era of filmmaking. Number 13. Mongo's sets filled huge hangars. Scale is something audiences feel before they consciously register it, and the production designers behind Mongo understood this completely. The environments constructed for the film were not modest soundstage builds dressed with clever lighting. They were enormous physical structures, some so vast they could only be housed in aircraft hangars that had been repurposed for the production. Danilo Donati's designs called for architecture that felt genuinely alien, and achieving that required building at a size that left no room for shortcuts. Multiple stages ran simultaneously, each containing a different environment within Ming's empire. The throne room, the war rocket bays, the ceremonial chambers, each existed as a full physical construction, populated with hundreds of costumed performers who filled the space with movement and texture. The sheer density of what was built gave the film a visual richness that communicated a complete world rather than a collection of sets. The scale of the construction also shaped how the film was shot. With enormous environments already built around them, the camera operators had genuinely vast spaces to move through, giving the film's compositions a grandeur that reflected reality rather than illusion. It was an approach that required extraordinary resources and coordination, but the result was a version of Mongo that felt fully inhabited, a living, breathing place that no amount of clever camera trickery alone could have conjured. Number 14. The strange Zarkov brain scene. Few sequences in the film are stranger or more disorienting than the moment Dr. Zarkov is subjected to a forced memory extraction. It was a scene that existed at the intersection of science fiction and psychological horror, and bringing it to life without digital tools required the crew to work creatively across every department simultaneously. The goal was to make the audience feel the experience rather than simply observe it, a blurring of the boundary between what was real and what was being forcibly removed. The approach combined layered optical effects with precisely controlled lighting that shifted the visual texture of the scene away from the film's usual vivid palette. Sound design played an equal role. The sonic environment of the sequence was constructed to create disorientation independent of what was visible on screen. Editors then wove these elements together into something that moved at an irregular rhythm, deliberately resisting the comfortable pace of the rest of the film. The result remains one of the most unusual sequences in the entire production. A moment where the film briefly becomes something closer to surrealist cinema than space adventure. For an actor like Topol, who brought considerable theatrical credibility to the role of Zarkov, the scene offered a rare opportunity to carry something genuinely demanding amid a film otherwise defined by spectacle. It stands today as proof that the production was capable of far darker registers than its reputation sometimes suggests, and that it wasn't afraid to go there. Number 15. The machine behind the miniatures. Big worlds have always been built small first. Long before audiences could be convinced that a war rocket the size of a city was tearing through Mongo's atmosphere, that rocket existed as a carefully constructed model sitting on a workbench somewhere in the production facility. Effects supervisor George Gibbs oversaw the miniature work that gave the film many of its most expansive visual moments: spacecraft, environments, and structures that would have been impossible to build at full scale on any available budget. The real craft lay not in building the miniatures, but in making them disappear into the larger image. Optical compositing technology allowed the effects team to combine footage of models with separately filmed plates containing actors or full-scale set elements. When executed precisely, the join between these layers became invisible. A miniature rocket became a full-sized war machine simply because the light, scale, and motion all agreed with each other convincingly enough. The technique also gave the production enormous creative flexibility. A miniature could be rebuilt, repositioned, or destroyed and reconstructed without the cost implications of full-scale construction. Sequences that would have been financially prohibitive to shoot practically became achievable through careful model work and patient compositing. The machines were small, but the results filled the screen, and for audiences in 1980, the illusion held completely, delivering a sense of scale that still impresses when viewed today. Number 16. Blue screen work pushed limits. Before digital compositing existed, placing actors convincingly inside environments that hadn't been built around them required an exacting and physically demanding process. The blue screen work on this production operated at a scale that tested the outer boundaries of what the technology could reliably deliver in 1979 and 1980. Entire sequences were filmed with performers working against blank blue backgrounds, with no visual reference for the world that would eventually surround them in the finished cut. The technical challenge began with light, to make the compositing work cleanly, to ensure that the blue background registered uniformly enough to be removed without leaving halos or artifacts around the actors. The crew needed illumination levels that were genuinely intense. Working under those conditions for extended periods was physically exhausting, and the margin for error was narrow. A single inconsistency in the blue surface could compromise an entire shot and require the sequence to be filmed again. Every blue screen setup also demanded meticulous pre-planning between the effects team and the director of photography. The angle, height, and movement of the camera during the live-action shoot had to match precisely with however the background element would eventually be filmed or constructed. Any mismatch would be visible the moment the layers were combined. That the finished film holds together as coherently as it does is a testament to the patience and technical discipline of a crew working at the edge of what their tools would allow. Number 17. The wires fans could see. Flying sequences have always existed in an uncomfortable space between wonder and the mechanics required to produce it. For this production, the Hawkmen's aerial battles and Flash's suspended moments were achieved through wire rigging. Performers lifted and moved through space by cables attached above them, with the crew working hard to keep those cables out of the camera's eye. In many shots, they succeeded. In others, particularly in early theatrical prints, they did not. Sharp-eyed viewers watching the film in cinemas noticed the problem. Wires caught the light at certain angles and became briefly visible, pulling audiences momentarily out of the illusion. It was not unusual for films of that era. Wire removal was a painstaking optical process that added cost and time, and decisions had to be made about which shots were worth the investment. Some visible wires simply made it through to the final print. Decades later, restoration work addressed many of these moments digitally. Modern releases cleaned up shots that original audiences had accepted as minor imperfections, smoothing the illusion into something closer to what the filmmakers had intended. It's a curious reversal. Technology that didn't exist when the film was made eventually went back and finished the job. For purists, the original wires are part of the film's charm. For everyone else, the restored version offers the flying sequences as they were always meant to look. Number 18. The dark version that came first. The film that reached theaters in 1980 was bright, theatrical, and deliberately camp, but that tone was not inevitable. Before Mike Hodges took the director's chair, the project had been developing under Nicholas Roeg, a filmmaker known for deeply atmospheric and psychologically complex work. His vision for the material bore almost no resemblance to what eventually reached the screen. Roeg's interpretation leaned into myth and archetype. Early development treated Flash and Dale not as comic strip heroes on a space adventure, but as something closer to primal figures, an Adam and Eve transported into a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The tone Roeg was pursuing was serious, strange, and considerably darker than anything a Flash Gordon audience might have expected. It would have been a genuinely different kind of science fiction film, closer in spirit to his earlier work than to the serials that inspired the source material. When Roeg departed and Hodges arrived, the direction shifted completely. The mythic weight was exchanged for wit, color, and theatrical exuberance. Whether Roeg's version would have worked commercially is impossible to say, but the concept artwork and early development notes suggest it would have been startling. The film that replaced it was startling in entirely different ways, which is perhaps why both versions remain fascinating to think about even now. Number 19. A trilogy was already planned. Confidence can be a dangerous thing in the film industry, and Dino De Laurentiis rarely suffered from a shortage of it. Before Flash Gordon had screened for a single paying audience, the producer had already begun laying the groundwork for a franchise. Plans for 2 sequels were reportedly in development, built on the assumption that the film would perform well enough to justify returning to Mongo with the same cast and creative team. Some of the actors who appeared in the film signed contracts that included options for follow-up pictures, a standard franchise-building mechanism, but one that communicated how seriously the production took its own sequel ambitions. The story had been constructed with continuation in mind, which is part of why certain plot threads in the finished film feel deliberately unresolved. The ending, in particular, was designed to function as both a conclusion and an opening. The sequels never came. The film performed modestly at the box office, finding a passionate audience, but not the mainstream commercial success that would have unlocked further installments. Over the years, it became a cult classic, beloved, endlessly rewatched, and quoted with genuine affection. It's an outcome De Laurentiis certainly didn't plan for, but in some ways a more lasting one. Franchises come and go. Cult classics tend to stay. Number 20. The ending almost turned horrific. Conclusions are where films reveal what they truly believe about their own stories, and the ending of this production went through significant transformation before arriving at what audiences finally saw. Early drafts and conceptual discussions imagined a climax far more disturbing than the theatrical finale that made it to screen. Some versions explored the idea of Ming undergoing grotesque physical transformations during the final confrontation, changes that would have pushed the film into genuinely unsettling territory. These ideas were gradually stripped away as production pressures mounted and the timeline compressed. There are practical realities to finishing a large-scale film on schedule, and elaborate practical effects sequences for a villain's transformation would have demanded time and resources that the production couldn't comfortably absorb. The creative appetite for darkness in the finale met the hard limits of budget and schedule, and the darkness retreated. What replaced those concepts was a conclusion that leaned into the film's theatrical energy rather than against it. Ming defeated in a moment of operatic chaos, with just enough ambiguity left at the edges to suggest the story wasn't entirely finished. The famous final image of the ring being recovered in the wreckage became one of cinema's more memorable unresolved endings. Whether the darker version would have served the film better is genuinely debatable, but what arrived instead has clearly stood the test of time. Number 21. Roeg's unmade adult version. The gap between what a film becomes and what it might have been is rarely as wide as it was here. When Nicolas Roeg was attached to the project in its earliest phase, the concept artwork and design thinking being developed around his vision suggested a science fiction world that was dense, surreal, and unmistakably aimed at mature audiences. The visual language being explored bore little resemblance to the primary colored spectacle that eventually defined the finished film. Casting ideas from that period pointed in equally unexpected directions. The figures being considered for key roles were not the kind of performers typically associated with comic strip adventure. They were actors whose work lived in more psychologically demanding territory. The overall impression from surviving records of this phase is of a production that intended to take the material somewhere genuinely confrontational, treating the mythology of Mongo as a framework for something closer to adult allegory than Saturday morning entertainment. When the project pivoted away from Roeg's direction, most of this material was set aside rather than adapted. Hodges built his version largely from scratch, borrowing the characters and the world but applying an entirely different creative philosophy. The contrast between the two approaches is striking enough that they almost feel like separate films sharing a title. Roeg's unmade version remains one of the more intriguing roads not taken in science fiction cinema, a film that exists only in documents, sketches, and the imagination of anyone who stumbles across the early development records. It is a ghost that has never stopped haunting the finished film. Number 22. Mongo's missing creature ally. Early storyboards and production documents from the development phase reveal a version of Mongo considerably more populated than the one audiences eventually explored. Among the concepts that didn't survive to the finished film was a creature companion, a friendly, large-scale beast intended to accompany the heroes in a role not entirely unlike the one Chewbacca filled in Star Wars. The design work apparently reached a reasonable level of development before the idea was set aside. The companion wasn't the only casualty. Designs for Lion Men, a distinct alien species that appeared in the original comic strips, were explored and then quietly dropped. Other creature concepts came and went during pre-production as the scope of the film was refined against the realities of budget and shooting schedule. Each removal simplified the world of Mongo slightly, pulling it away from the sprawling alien ecosystem the earliest planning had envisioned. The reasons for these cuts were rarely creative in origin. Building and operating large-scale creature effects in that era was enormously expensive and technically demanding, and a production already stretched across aircraft hangar sets and extensive wirework had limited capacity to absorb additional complexity. What remained after the cuts was still an extraordinarily rich visual world, but the missing creatures serve as a reminder that the Mongo audiences saw was already a scaled-back version of something even more ambitious that never quite made it off the page. the full vision of that world remains tantalizingly out of reach. Number 23. Much of the BTS history vanished. For a production of such evident scale and cultural staying power, the amount of documentation that survived the decades following release is surprisingly thin. Costumes that had taken skilled craftspeople weeks to construct were lost, discarded, or scattered after filming ended. Photographs from the set, the kind of behind-the-scenes record that productions now carefully archive, went missing in ways that have never been fully explained. Props that had populated entire hangar-sized environments simply disappeared into the general entropy that follows a film's completion. Reconstructing the production history required the kind of detective work more commonly associated with historical research than film journalism. Writers and researchers attempting to tell the story of how the film was made found themselves piecing together accounts from interviews conducted years after the fact, cross-referencing contradictory recollections, and working from whatever physical evidence had managed to survive. The gaps in the record are sometimes as revealing as what remains. The fragility of film history is a recurring theme for productions from this era, when preservation was rarely prioritized once a movie had finished its theatrical run. What happened to Flash Gordon's physical legacy was not unusual. It was simply the norm for how the industry treated its own artifacts at the time. The irony is that a film which constructed entire worlds from scratch left behind so little evidence of how that construction was actually done. What survives is the film itself, and fortunately, that turned out to be more than enough to keep the story alive. Number 24. A warning added years later. Films do not exist in a fixed relationship with the culture around them. They age, and the culture ages differently, and sometimes the distance between the two becomes significant enough to require acknowledgement. Modern releases of the film in the United Kingdom now carry contextual notices, informing viewers that certain character portrayals reflect attitudes and conventions from the era in which the film was made. The notices appear before the film begins, framing what follows as a historical artifact rather than a current statement. The warnings do not alter the film itself. No scenes are removed, no dialogue is adjusted, and no visual elements are modified. The intention is context rather than censorship, giving viewers information that allows them to engage with the material knowingly rather than encountering it cold. It is an approach that has been applied to a growing number of classic films across various platforms and distributors, reflecting a broader shift in how the entertainment industry navigates its own back catalogue. The debate around these notices tends to generate more heat than the notices themselves usually warrant. Critics argue they are unnecessary interventions into completed artistic works. Supporters contend they are a responsible minimum when distributing content that some viewers may find reductive or uncomfortable. The film itself is unchanged either way, still vivid, still strange, still entirely itself. The warning sits at the door but has no power over what happens once the audience steps inside, and the opening notes of Queen's soundtrack fill the room. Number 25. The ending was joke and setup. Few final images in science fiction cinema have generated as much discussion relative to their screen time as the closing shot of a hand retrieving Ming's ring from the wreckage. It lasts only seconds, but it has occupied film conversations for more than 4 decades. Mike Hodges has described the moment as a deliberate nod to the cliffhanger conventions of the old Flash Gordon serials, a wink at the storytelling tradition the film had been lovingly referencing throughout its entire runtime. At the same time, the ending was entirely sincere in its franchise ambitions. The ring recovery wasn't purely playful, it was also a genuine story beat designed to feed into the sequels that De Laurentiis fully expected to make. The two intentions coexisted without contradiction. The director's knowing homage and the producer's commercial planning occupied the same few seconds of film, each serving a different master simultaneously. What makes the ending so enduring is precisely this double nature. Because the sequels never arrived, the shot became something unintended, an open door that was never walked through, a promise the series couldn't keep. That unresolved quality transformed it from a franchise setup into something more poignant, the last frame of a world that existed completely only once. Hodges got his joke. De Laurentiis didn't get his trilogy. And audiences got an ending that has proven far more memorable than any sequel likely would have been, which may be the most fitting conclusion this particular story could have received. More than 4 decades after it first lit up cinema screens, Flash Gordon remains one of the most visually distinctive and genuinely singular science fiction films ever made. What looked from the outside like pure spectacle was, beneath the surface, a production shaped by abandoned visions, extraordinary practical ingenuity, turbulent casting decisions, and ambitions that stretched well beyond what a single film could contain. The story behind the screen turned out to be nearly as strange and colorful as anything happening on it. What's remarkable is how much of that chaos produced something coherent and beloved. A lead actor whose voice was partially rebuilt in post-production. A soundtrack assembled in secrecy by one of the world's biggest rock bands. Sets so large they required aircraft hangars. A director layering satire beneath adventure, while a producer quietly planned a trilogy that never came. A darker, mythic version of the story that was abandoned before most people even knew it existed. All of it, somehow, converged into a film that has never stopped finding new audiences. One that grows richer, not dimmer, the more you know about how it was actually made. If you enjoyed uncovering the secrets behind this cult classic, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive like this one. And let us know in the comments, which of these behind-the-scenes stories surprised you the most?